On April 12, 1945, Vice President Harry S. Truman was called to Eleanor Roosevelt's study. "Harry," Mrs. Roosevelt said, "the president is dead." Later, Truman described his reaction. "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." That evening, Truman was sworn in as President of the United States. Most Americans knew little about their new chief. He had been born on a Missouri farm, had served with distinction in the Senate. But what sort of president would he make? The nation was at war. Suddenly thrust upon the world stage, Truman had to make a frightening decision. For the first time, he learned that scientists had developed a new weapon of devastating power: the atomic bomb. To end the war quickly, he ordered the destruction of 2 Japanese cities. With the war's end came the formation of the United Nations. American leadership, Truman knew, would be essential to its success. He believed the nation should now play a major role in world affairs. Ominously, a new threat was arising in Europe. The Soviet Union, America's ally in the war against Nazi Germany, was now a formidably powerful nation. By 1945, and with large numbers of Russian troops stationed in Eastern Europe, many of the old tensions between East and West began to reappear. It was soon clear that the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, had no intention of withdrawing his troops from occupied countries. During their assault on Germany, the Allied armies had occupied these areas. The Western Allies regarded the occupation as temporary. Stalin, however, threw up a fortified barrier to prevent outside interference and started to weld occupied countries into a Soviet bloc. In the words of Winston Churchill, an iron curtain had descended across the continent. Equally ominous, it seemed that internal conflict and disorder in Greece and Turkey might cause those nations to fall under communist control. At a summit meeting in Potsdam, Germany, Truman had gained some insight into Stalin's plans. Knowing that war-weakened nations would be easy prey, Truman said, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." Thus, the United States prepared to meet a new kind of challenge. Not immediately military, so much as political and economic. It soon acquired a name: the Cold War. The United States was now the only nation strong enough to block Soviet expansion. Accepting this global responsibility, Truman introduced a policy of containment, a policy based on alliances and strong bases near the perimeter of communist-held territory. To bolster Western democracies, food and equipment were poured into weakened nations. Western Europe recovered quickly. And when, for an entire year, a Soviet blockade sealed off Allied land routes into West Berlin, Truman stood firm. A massive airlift kept the city alive. The Western Allies would not be pushed out. But it was in Asia, not Europe, that containment faced the ultimate test. After a bitter civil war, China had fallen under communist control. The Korean Peninsula, the dagger pointing at the heart of Japan, now assumed key strategic importance. From 1895 until the end of World War II, Korea had been held by Japan. After Japan's defeat, Allied occupation forces moved in. American troops occupying the southern part of the country, Soviet troops the north. The 38th parallel served as a convenient dividing line. The Soviets, however, soon made it clear they regarded the parallel as a partition. They sealed off the border and installed a government modeled on communist lines. While the United States was reluctant to build up Korean military power, the Soviets transformed the North Korean army into a deadly, well-equipped force. At 4 a.m. on June 24, 1950, the North Koreans launched a surprise attack across the lightly defended border. The president was at home in Independence, Missouri, when he heard the news. While flying to Washington, his thoughts turned to the topic of aggression. I recalled earlier instances, Manchuria, Ethiopia, Austria, how each time that the democracies failed to act, it had encouraged the aggressors to keep going ahead. If this was allowed to go unchallenged, it would mean a third world war. Meanwhile, the UN Security Council met in an emergency session. It branded North Korea's action a breach of the peace and demanded an immediate end to the hostilities. The Soviet delegate was absent, so could not veto the decision. Truman called his own emergency meeting. The authority of the UN and the whole system of collective security were being put to the test. As the most powerful nation of the free world, the United States must act. But how? As a preliminary move, Truman ordered General MacArthur's forces, based in Japan, to get supplies and ammunition to the South Koreans. But the South Koreans were rapidly being overwhelmed. Seeing no alternative, Truman ordered American naval and Air Force units to give direct support. There was one stipulation. American forces would only operate south of the 38th parallel. Said Truman, "Everything I have done in the past 5 years has been to try to avoid making a decision such as I had to make tonight." His decision was backed by a UN resolution calling on all member nations to render such assistance to the Republic of Korea as may be necessary to repel the armed attack. Still, the situation worsened. Despite the risk of drawing Communist China or the Soviet Union into the war, Truman gave permission for American aircraft to attack targets north of the parallel. Meanwhile, General MacArthur went to the battle zone to see for himself what was happening. He was horrified. Early on the morning of June 30th, the President received a phone call from the Pentagon. He listened in silence to a report of General MacArthur's findings, then answered, "Yes." Yes meant that Truman had authorized the use of American ground forces in Korea. In less than a week, an American president had taken his country into a full-scale war. He had done so on his own initiative, as commander-in-chief, without the official approval of Congress, though, in fact, both Congress and public opinion later proved to be firmly behind him. The war was termed a police action. Its object was to resist and repel North Korean aggression. This nation's limited objective, to protect the independence and integrity of the government of South Korea. 16 other nations also sent troops, forming the first truly international army in history. But the United States continued to bear most of the burden. Under MacArthur's command, UN forces swept northward to the Yalu River. Then, when it seemed victory was near, thousands of communist Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River and entered the war in support of North Korea. UN forces were driven back to the 38th parallel. At this time came a sharp clash of opinion between President Truman and his commander in the field. MacArthur wished to bomb enemy bases on the Asian mainland. Truman's policy, supported by a United Nations resolution, called for a police action or limited war. When the general continued to openly oppose him, Truman made a courageous decision. Despite the risk of public indignation, Truman invoked his powers as commander-in-chief and relieved MacArthur of his command. Initially, the nation reacted with shock and dismay at the dismissal of this fabled and popular leader. MacArthur returned to a hero's welcome, but it was soon clear that public opinion supported the president's action. The American attitude toward the war, however, was soon to undergo a change. The fighting settled into a long, grueling stalemate. Public dissatisfaction rose steadily, as did criticism of Truman's policy. Despite political attacks from Senator Joseph McCarthy on the right and his many critics on the left, Truman held fast. Eventually, after 3 years of fighting and interminable negotiations, a truce was negotiated by Truman's successor, Dwight Eisenhower. On July 27, 1953, the war was brought to an end. During the fighting, more than 1 million people had been killed. More than 2 million were left homeless. Korea remained a country divided, partitioned at the 38th parallel. the war had accomplished little for either side. However, the UN had survived a deadly crisis. If South Korea had fallen, the UN would have been discredited and might have collapsed altogether. And President Truman had shown the communist world that, if necessary, the United States would back its policy of containment with force of arms. He had acted swiftly and with resolution, a vital factor in the dawning age of nuclear weapons. He had interpreted his constitutional powers broadly and committed the nation to war without congressional approval. If he had waited, it might have been too late. Yet, in meeting the Korean crisis, did he exceed the limits of presidential power? Again, in the 1960s and 70s, Americans found themselves fighting a land war in Asia. Again, without Congress having declared war. Like Korea, Vietnam was conducted as a limited action. To an even greater extent, public dissatisfaction mounted steadily. Once more, the question was raised. How much power should the president have to commit the nation in overseas struggles? It is a question with no simple answer.